Yamuna Tira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunj Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivardhari Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yashoda Nandana Braja Jana Ranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Shri Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna. Jaya Radha Govardhanadhari Radha Govardhanadhari Sri Radhe Jaya Krishna Balaram Jaya Giri Govardhan Krishna Balaram Jaya Giri Govardhan Jaya Krishna Balaram Jaya Gauranitai, 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 Jai Gauranitai. Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Sa eva purusastasmad andam nirbhidya nirgataha sahasro vangri bhavakshaha sahasranana sirshavan sa eva purusastasmad andam nirbhidya nirgataha Sahasravangri bhavaksha Sahasranana sirshavan Saha He, the Lord, Eva, Himself, Purusha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Tasmat, from within the universe, Andam Hiranyagarbha, Nirbhidya, dividing, Nirgataha, came out, Sahasra, thousands, Uru, thighs, Angri, legs, Bahu, arms, Aksha, eyes, Sahasra, thousands of, Anana, mouths, Shirshavan, with heads also. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. The Lord Mahavishnu, although lying in the causal ocean, came out of it and dividing Himself as Hiranyagarbha, He entered into each universe and assumed the Virat Rupa, with thousands of legs, arms, mouths, heads, etc. Please repeat. The Lord Mahavishnu, although lying in the causal ocean, came out of it and dividing Himself as Hiranyagarbha, He entered into each universe and assumed the Virat Rupa, with thousands of legs, arms, mouths, heads, etc. Purport. The expansion of the planetary system within each universe. The expansion of the planetary systems within each and every universe are situated in the different parts of the Virat Rupa, universal form of the Lord. And they are described as follows. Text 36. Great philosophers imagine that the complete planetary systems in the universe are displays of the different upper and lower limbs of the universal body of the Lord. Purport. The word kalpayanti, or imagine, is significant. The Virat, universal form of the Lord, the universal form of the Absolute, is an imagination of the speculative philosophers who are unable to adjust to the eternal two-handed form of Lord Sri Krishna. Although the universal form as imagined by the great philosophers is one of the features of the Lord, it is more or less imaginary. It is said that the 7 upper planetary systems are situated above the waist of the universal form, whereas the lower planetary systems are situated below His waist. The idea impressed herein is that the Supreme Lord is conscious of every part of His body, and nowhere in the creation is there anything beyond His control. Om Ajnana Timirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmilitam Jaina Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine. So Lord Vishnu, lying in the causal ocean, expands Himself and enters into each universe as Garbhodaksha Vishnu. And this is also described here as Him becoming the Virat Rupa, or in English, the universal form. So, in one sense, everything in the whole universe is a part of the body of the Lord. And we're reading in this chapter how the different elements of the universe, the different modes of nature, the different parts of the false ego, the mind, the different elements, everything is created, but then nothing happens until the Lord enters into that. So in the similar way that our body, when someone dies, when the soul leaves the body, nothing happens, it's just a dead body. So the body is dead until when the soul is there. So in the same way the universe is, the matter is unable to move. It is just matter until the Lord enters into it. And therefore the universe can be seen in one way, although it is described as sort of an imaginary form, because it's not really the form, the eternal form of the Lord. The Lord has his eternal form with two hands and various four-handed Vishnu forms, but that he enters into the universe to make it act. So in the last class we were talking about how this is a big difference between Vedic knowledge and the modern idea of science or knowledge, is that the Vedic knowledge is all about how consciousness interacts with matter. This is the important part. So, and the modern science is more or less how matter interacts with matter. So have, like the periodic table, hydrogen, helium, all these things, and they're all classified according to how they interact with each other. You have your noble gases, these don't interact with others because the outer electron shell is full. All of these, the sciences are all based around how matter interacts with itself or doesn't interact, or how all the different things. So the difference between that and the Vedic knowledge is that the Vedic knowledge is how consciousness, the living entity, interacts with matter. So you have certain activities in certain modes. You have mode of goodness is enlightening to the living entity. Mode of ignorance is very binding, causes ignorance, covers the knowledge. Mode of passion makes the living entity very enthusiastic to create material situations. So the whole thrust of Vedic knowledge is classifying the world according to how it interacts with consciousness, and therefore how ultimately to extract the living entity from the world, how the living entity can get extracted from the world. Whereas the modern knowledge is simply how not simply, it's obviously a very complicated arrangement. This universe is a very complicated machine to understand, but it's how the machine works itself. So of course knowing how the machine works is one subset of getting out of the machine. And this is said in 11th verse of Ishopanishad, that one has to understand the avidya, or the workings of the machine, of the illusory energy, to be able to get free from it. Avidyaya tirta mrityum tirtva, that one overcomes death by understanding how this material world works, and one attains the spiritual by understanding the spiritual nature. But if we don't understand the fundamental difference between Vedic science, which is about how consciousness interacts with matter, and Western science, which is about how matter interacts with matter, then we may get confused. You may think, oh, this is more superior, or this is more simple. The Vedic knowledge is simple or something, but actually it's not simple. It's talking about how consciousness interacts with matter. So you might, like an example might be, say you're driving from here to Sydney, if you were allowed to, if you weren't in this strange situation we are in at the moment. But if you were driving from here to Sydney, for example, you might say that the Vedic knowledge is like the map. That's right. The Vedic knowledge is the map of how you get from where you are to where you want to be. Right? You want to get from here to Sydney, there's the map in the glove box. I mean, showing my age here, but all us old timers will remember, before the smartphones and before the what you call GPS and Google Maps and all that, you used to have a map. You used to go to the servo station. Servo. And you'd get a map and be like, I'm trying to go to Sydney. Oh, I don't need a map of the whole of New South Wales. How am I going to get there? So the Vedic knowledge is like the map of where you're going, right? And in that example, what would the Western knowledge be? If you're driving to Sydney, what else is in your glove box of your car? What is the Western knowledge? What is not Western, but the modern science? If the Vedic knowledge is the map of how you get there, the modern science is what in that example? Yes, the car manual. Is that Padma? Can you say that? People got masks on, it's hard to see who's talking. Am I supposed to be wearing a mask giving class? Is it alright? Okay, cool. I have one here in my pocket just in case. If we need, because I have them in the restaurant all the time. But yeah, probably, I think this distance is okay. So anyway, the modern is like the manual of the car, right? So it's how the car works. So the modern science is how does this material world work? How do all the elements interact, everything like that? But if you don't have a map, you don't know where you're going, then what's the use of the manual in the car? What's the use of knowing everything about how matter interacts if you don't know where you're going? You can be a Nobel Prize winner or the president of the whatever big rich man or on the cover of the Vogue magazine or whatever in this life, and next life you come back as a lizard or something. So if you don't know the map, if you don't know, that if you turn left here, if you accept, all this mode of ignorance and all these kind of things, which is turning this way on your map, you're going to end up in Wagga Wagga when you actually were trying to get to Sydney. So the Vedic knowledge is it's where you're going, where you as a person, as a conscious entity, where are you going and how to get there. So a subset of that, of course, is how the material works, but it's just a subset of that. So this is the idea of the universal form, as Prabhupada says here, that the idea impressed herein is that the Supreme Lord is conscious, of every part of his body. He's conscious of every part, and there's no part. It's just like we're conscious of our body. We're conscious of the feet. If we stub our toe, we feel it. We're conscious of that. So similarly, the Lord is conscious, and that's this idea of the universal form. It's described for the neophyte, for the introductory student, and in some way our minds are neophyte even after chanting for so long. Still, we have these neophyte ideas, and one of the ideas that the universal form helps with is this idea that everything's separate. There's a tree, there's a stone, there's a whatever, everything like this. But the universal form, when you meditate on that, it gives you the idea. The tree is the hairs on his body. The river. It's not like, this is a river that I can go and exploit and use, and then I can take this from the tree, and this kind of exploited mentality. It helps you to think, actually, this is one personality. This is one form of a supreme personality, and that's his hair. That's the veins of his body. So it makes you think in that way, rather than in the small-minded way. So, in Srimad Bhagavatam 2.1.26, Srila Prabhupada brings out a very important point about this, and really that really gets to the essence or the heart of what is our process, the Bhakti Yoga process that we're following. And he says in that purport, everything and anything of the manifested world rests on him, as confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita 9.4. But that does not imply that everything and anything in the vision of a materialist is the Supreme Personality. The conception of the universal form of the Lord gives a chance to the materialist to think of the Supreme Lord, but the materialist must know for certain that his visualization of the world in a spirit of lording over it is not God realization. The materialistic view of exploitation of the material resources is occasioned by the illusion of the external energy of the Lord. And as such, if anyone wants to realize the supreme truth by conceiving of the universal form of the Lord, he must cultivate the service attitude. unless the service attitude is revived, the conception of Virat realization will have very little effect on the seer. So Srila Prabhupada's making it clear that any of these processes, whether it's meditation on the universal form or different yogic processes, it doesn't have really any effect unless one actually addresses the issue of consciousness. And we know that the reason the pure soul comes to the material world is for this from contaminated consciousness. It's the free will to be separate from the Lord, but it's the contaminated consciousness of not wanting to be the servant of the Lord and wanting to experience being the master. So there's a nice pastime in Pastimes of Lord Chaitanya where the devotees were doing kirtan at the house of Srivas Thakur, and the kirtan started, and every night Lord Chaitanya would go actually to the house of Srivas, and they would do kirtan there, and they would do all night basically. They would do kirtan, and this was before Lord Chaitanya took the Sankirtan movement out. So it just started in the courtyard of Srivas Thakur in Mayapur. And actually, this time the kirtan began, and after some time, Lord Chaitanya, he said, he said, hang on, stop the kirtan. He said, there's something wrong here. There's somebody that has the wrong consciousness. They don't have the consciousness of a servant. There's something wrong in the consciousness, and because of that, he said, I'm not actually feeling the pure love for Krishna that normally I feel in chanting, in glorifying the Lord with my devotees. So of course, it's described there that all the devotees, they immediately thought, oh wow, what have I done? We know the material consciousness that's very prevalent, and that we have in ourselves as well. If we examine that, we really like to externalize our problems. That it's I'm suffering in this world, yes, but the reason I'm suffering is because of this person, or because of this government, or because of this policy, or because of whatever, something outside of myself. But we see in this pastime, all the devotees were thinking, there's some problem. What did I do? What's my consciousness? What is my part in that? Did I cause some offense? Did I have the wrong mentality? So they were all very humble, and they were thinking in this way, that immediately they were thinking, what was my fault? What did I do? How did I affect this situation? So actually what happened was, Srivas Thakur, he said, actually my Lord, it is true, there is somebody here that's not one of your devotees, but you see, he's a very pure brahmachari, and he's been living in the mountains, he's been meditating in the forest, just begging a little bit of milk here and there, and he's just dressed in tree bark. He's a very, very pure brahmachari, and he wanted to come and see your kirtan. So I thought, well, it's okay, he's very pure, let him sit. So he's sitting in this, like, behind this sort of cupboard, behind this curtain area, and he's watching the kirtan. Lord Chaitanya said, okay, so bring that brahmachari here. So he spoke to the brahmachari, and brahmachari came, and he said, what are you doing here? He said, if you're so renounced and you're meditating in the forest, why are you here in the city among all the householders? He said, actually, you don't have a mood of service. You don't have the service mood to the Supreme Lord. You're here just to get some adoration, some distinction from the householders. He said, you're actually not qualified. He said, these are householders, but they have the mood of service. Whatever they have, they're trying to use to serve the Lord. They're trying to please the Lord. They have the bhakti, the service attitude. He said, even though you're a brahmachari, he said, you're trying to enjoy. You're trying to enjoy the facility, trying to enjoy getting some name and fame by coming to the city. He said, so therefore you're actually not qualified to be in this kirtan. Show him out. So brahmachari was very chastened, and he left the kirtan, and he was sitting outside, and then the kirtan started again. Hare Haraya Nama Krishna Yada. Started up beautiful kirtan. And the brahmachari is sitting outside listening to that kirtan. And after some time he started to feel, actually what Lord Chaitanya said is true. I'm here for all these other reasons. I want name and fame, I want some facility, I want people to notice me, I want some, interaction, I want all these different things, but I'm not actually here to serve the Lord. I'm not actually here for that reason, but all these other devotees, that's why they're here. They're actually trying to serve the Lord, trying to help in the Lord's mission. And then when he said that, he actually had a change of heart. He was thinking, he said, actually, I'm not qualified. He's right, I don't have this service mood. And Lord Chaitanya could understand, and then he sent the devotees and said, actually bring that brahmachari now. He has the correct mood. He can actually join in the kirtan. So this is the same point Prabhupada's bringing out here. The whole thing of the whole essence of bhakti yoga, and which is why it's so powerful, is it addresses the actual issue of why we're in this material world. It doesn't just tinker with the edges. It doesn't do an external show of, being able to control the senses and or manifesting some jyoti or whatever. It doesn't do any of that. It actually addresses the issue of us being a servant of the Lord. And that's why bhakti yoga is the lift, the elevator, straight back to the spiritual world. Because this is why we're here. This is why we're in this material world, to try to be the master. And if we can, as Krishna says in 11th canto, Uddhava Gita, he says to Uddhava, he says, there's only 3 processes of elevation. He says there's knowledge, there's work, and there's devotion. And he said, if someone by hearing about me can develop the idea that he's a servant of the Lord, then he can very quickly, attain back to his original spiritual nature. When Lord Chaitanya was dancing in front of the Rath Yatra cart, in front of Lord Jagannath, he was reciting many verses, and one verse he recited was this one: I'm not a Brahmana, I'm not a Kshatriya, I'm not a Vaishya, I'm not a Sudra, nor am I a brahmachari, a householder, a vanaprastha or sannyasi. I identify myself only as the servant of the servant of the servant of the lotus feet of Lord Sri Krishna, the maintainer of the gopis. He's like an ocean of nectar, and he's the cause of universal, transcendental bliss. He is always existing with brilliance. So the last line, the very famous verse, of course, is Gopi Bhartu Pada Kamalayo Dasa Dasa Anudas. This, in Srila Prabhupada's books, we read this word servant, all through it. And we may not relate to that, because who has a servant? No one has a servant nowadays. But what do they call the servant nowadays? It starts with E. It's the employee, isn't it? Anyway, the thing is that a servant, it just means somebody who's getting paid to do something. And this is an employee, and I was kind of laughing to myself, but I was meditating on this, how nowadays they don't even use the word employee. If you go to Bunnings and stuff like that, team members. But okay, you see, if you don't follow the order from your manager, how long you're a team member? Not very long. So whether we say servant and employee, this is the same idea. That you have said, okay, you tell me whatever you want me to do, I'll do that. Of course, within the bounds of the job, whatever it is. But nobody, the thing is, nobody likes the idea of being a servant. But actually, if we look at it, if we think about it in terms of being an employee, the issue most people have is not being an employee. The issue most people have is, who am I? Who am I being an employee of? What company, or who is my boss? And actually, if we say, especially in India, they'll say, a government job. Oh, it's a government job, very good. As an employee of the government, because you know that the government's not going to, once you've got a government job, it's very good. And even here, in Australia, same everywhere around the world. My sister has a job now in the public service, and she has a particular job. She liked this job, this department better than that department, because they they're caring for people and it's a very satisfying job. So she's very happy. I have a job in the public service and it's very steady. And she was telling me on the weekend, oh, now they're offering me a permanent position in the public service. Oh, very good. So people don't actually have an issue with being a servant or an employee, as we call it nowadays. But what they have an issue is who am I being an employee of? You know, if somebody says, oh, I just finished law school, I got a job with, you know, someone, huge law firm, you know, and they've got this great salary and everything. Everyone's, wow, wonderful, you know. So the actual issue is who are you an employee of? Who's the boss? And so that's the thing. As devotees, we're saying, you know, we want to have the Supreme Lord as the boss. We want to have the supreme person who's looking after, and his representatives, his pure devotees. They're our bosses. We're all going to be employees. Actually, we're all going to be servants, employed. We all have to take shelter of somebody and take some sustenance from someone. But it's just a matter of who that is. So serving Krishna, becoming the servant of Krishna, becoming the servant of Krishna's devotees. Actually, we can't directly become the servant of Krishna. In the conditioned state, we don't know Krishna. We cannot know. But we serve his devotee. Dasa anudas. Right? We become the servant of his devotee, of our spiritual master, and he's the servant of his spiritual master. And actually all the spiritual masters, they're all thinking the same way. Their identity is not as spiritual masters. That's not their identification. They identify themselves as servants. So everyone in this bhakti process, a wonderful process, that everybody's thinking, I'm the servant. And even if they're getting some respect, some glorification, one devotee said that, you know, in one disciple of Srila Prabhupada, he was watching the Guru Puja once, and Srila Prabhupada's getting worshipped by so many people. There's so much, you know, glorification, Jai Prabhupada. They're singing the Sri Guru Chant, they're singing the prayers, everything to Prabhupada. And this devotee could see that Prabhupada, what was he doing? Was he sitting there thinking, yes, this is it, yes, what was his identity? No, he was sitting there singing the prayers too. The devotee could see he's singing to his spiritual master. He's not thinking, oh yeah, no, he's thinking, he's the servant. You know, and everyone's thinking, Prabhupada's my master, I'm the servant. But Prabhupada's thinking, I'm the servant of Bhaktisiddhanta. Bhaktisiddhanta's thinking, he's the servant, you know, like that, dasa. Amazing, wonderful process, wonderful. So this is the secret, open secret, and you know, our minds are constantly telling us, no, be the master, no, you can enjoy this, you can, but excuse me, but we have to, you know, constantly remind ourselves, that's how we got here. That's how we got in this problem. And actually the goal is to develop the service attitude. And actually if we have that, as Krishna says in Uddhava Gita, that when we develop that, everything else comes. There's a nice story with Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, that one brahmana, learned brahmana who knew Sanskrit and everything, he came from Calcutta, he came from somewhere to see Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj. And he said, oh Maharaj, I have this very, very technical point of Shastra, of philosophy, only you can answer this point. And Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj said, well, you know what, I'm a little busy now, but you go and help the pujaris. They need some help with helping out with the, you know, washing the plates and so forth. And after you've done that, to come back, then I'll answer your question. No problem. I said, okay, fine. So he went to the servant, and he's sitting there, he's washing the plates. And he's saying, why am I washing the plate? Oh, I'm like a servant, aren't I? Yeah, I'm washing the plate. Oh, that's what I actually do. My position is actually a servant. And as soon as he had that idea, instead of I'm the master of Sanskrit and I'm the master of this and I am my intelligence, I'm working everything out, blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I'm going a bit much. As soon as he had that idea, and I'm the servant, then suddenly all the answers to a question came. The answer to his question came because the stumbling block was that he wasn't understanding that he's the servant, that we're the servant. When Lord Chaitanya was instructing Sanatana Goswami, there's a very beautiful pastime. And Sanatana Goswami was, although he was born in a Brahmin family, he was working as a minister for the Mohammedan government, and of course they were meat eating, and the government ministers are, eating meat and drinking beer and whatever. And Sanatana Goswami had, he associated with them. He was in that association of people doing those things. And so he felt, he'd become fallen due to that association. And he said to Lord Chaitanya, they're thinking I'm very learned, but I don't know who I am. I'm very, he presented himself as very fallen actually. And Lord Chaitanya, he's, these interactions between Lord Chaitanya and his, advanced devotees, his Nitya Siddha, super advanced devotees, are just incredible, because Lord Chaitanya, he glorifies his devotees so much. And he said, actually, Sanatan, you know everything. You've got the mercy of Krishna. But he said, and you're a sadhu. But he said, actually, a sadhu just inquires for the sake of strictness. He said, very nice verse. Just one verse he put there. And you can see that even though, a sadhu, even though, in our case, like we might know something, but by inquiring, by hearing that from an authority, by hearing that from someone senior, we're helping ourselves. We're hearing that instruction. And Lord Chaitanya, for our instruction, edification, he explained that this Sanatana Goswami already knows everything. He's got the mercy of Krishna, and he is actually the most learned. But he's just inquiring for the sake of strictness, for the sake to establish, what is the siddhanta, what is the situation. So anyway, Lord Chaitanya answered the question of who are you? He said a very famous verse, Jivara Surupoi, Krishnera Nitya Das, right? He said the eternal situation, the eternal nature of the living entity is to be a servant of Krishna, of the Supreme Lord. That's the eternal nature of the living entity. He said, this is, you want to know who you are? That's who you are, right? This is the whole essence really of Bhakti Yoga, is re-establishing, reawakening that. It's not something that's unnatural, although it feels unnatural at first because we've spent so many lifetimes trying to be the master. But also Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's explained in one very nice verse, Nitya Siddha Krishna Prema, Sadhya Kabunai, Shravanadi Shuddha Chitta Korayodai. That this consciousness of being the servant of Krishna is already there in the heart, it's established, and it just has to be reawakened, So I'll just tell one more story. We might have enough time for one more. And this is that, looking at this idea of becoming a servant, and how becoming a servant of the Lord, becoming a bhakti yogi, how this attains, gives one all perfection, and compared to other processes. So this is a pastime of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya meeting Lord Chaitanya. So when Lord Chaitanya came to Jagannath Puri Temple, he was actually alone. And does anyone know why he was alone at that time? Even though he came with Mukunda Datta, he came with Lord Nityananda, he came with so many devotees from taking sannyas, he went to Jagannath Puri. Ah, very good. Yes, exactly. What's your name, Puri? Chaitanya? Bhav. Chaitanya Bhav. Really? Wow. Amazing name. How do you... Nice to meet you. Yes, that's why. Because Lord Nityananda broke his danda. So he was... Lord Chaitanya was in ecstasy going along the road, and he was in his internal consciousness, and Lord Nityananda in his ecstasy, he saw the danda as like a sort of representation of the external formality that Lord Chaitanya somehow had to sort of prove that he was an exalted, he was in the Varnashram system, and he was the sannyasi, he was, had to do this and that, and he, in his ecstasy, he said, what is this danda? And he broke the danda and he threw it into the river, the Bagu Nadi river, which is now called the Danda Banga Nadi, right? The river where the danda was broken. So anyway, Lord Chaitanya, when he heard this, when he came back to his external consciousness, he was externally upset. Of course, internally it's a very ecstatic pastime between the two of them. But externally, he said, this is a symbol of the regulated principles and following the proper path in devotional service and showing others the good example. He said, this is something it's very, very hurtful to me, that I'm very upset that you've broken my danda. He said, you all of you can decide. You either go ahead of me to the temple, because they were only a few miles from the temple. They were almost at Puri temple. You can go ahead of me to the temple, or you can go behind me, but don't come with me. I'm going alone. So the devotees Mukunda Datta, and they said, no, you go ahead, Lord. You go ahead, and we'll catch up. So Lord Chaitanya ended up in the pastime. He ended up in Jagannath Puri temple alone. And of course, he was in ecstasy already before. I mean, he was in ecstasy. He's Krishna, so he's always in ecstasy. But in his pastime, he was really in ecstasy when he took initiation at Gaya from Ishvara Puri. Then he really started to manifest his love of Godhead and everything. But when he took sannyas, and then when he took sannyas, also he was headed towards Vrindavan, of course. And Lord Nityananda, by some arrangement, had made him go to the house of Advaitacharya. The devotees from Mayapur had come, and they'd spent many days there with him to relieve their separation. But by the time he got to Jagannath Puri and he saw the temple for it's about 5 miles away, you can see the top of the temple, he was completely in ecstasy, completely. And then by the time he got into the temple and he saw Lord Jagannath, then he was just, falling on the ground in the mood of, Srimati Radharani in her separation from Krishna, the intense spiritual emotions, so he was lying on the ground in the temple in front of the deity, and then some of the pandas, they were coming, who is this guy? Why he's lying on the ground? Oh, you pick him up, check him out. You're not allowed to lie down in front of Lord Jagannath. That's against the rules, isn't it? So it happened to be at that time that the head of the temple was Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, and he came and he said, hang on a second. I've heard, he'd read in the Shastras about the great souls have these ecstatic symptoms, and sometimes they lose external consciousness, their hairs stand on end, they're perspiring, they're crying, all of these things that happen out of intense spiritual emotion. And he said, just hang on, and he held a little cotton swab, and he could see the Lord was breathing. But he was actually not in external consciousness, from some other place. So he said, take him to my residence. And then, of course, it's a long story, but basically, Lord Chaitanya, he converted, or he opened the heart of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya to the beauty of this idea of being the servant of the Lord, and how that is actually the highest position, And of course, after that, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, there's a very nice pastime where he was sleeping, and Lord Chaitanya had gone to Mangalati in the Jagannath temple, and he'd been given some Mahaprasad by the pujaris, and he brought it back, and he came he actually came while Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was still lying in the bed, and he gave him the Mahaprasad, and he sat up, and then Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, who was previously very attached to the sort of, the smarter rules and everything, said, oh, this is a prasadam of the Lord, it has to be accepted immediately at any time. The highest thing is actually being the servant of Krishna in bhakti. And the Lord was very happy with that. And he actually came to see Lord Chaitanya once, and he had 2 verses written. He had it written on a palm leaf, and he was bringing these verses to give to Lord Chaitanya. And the very wonderful verses, and one devotee, Mukunda Datta, he could understand, he had a premonition about what Lord Chaitanya was going to do with these palm leaves, because they were directly glorifying the Lord as being, Lord Chaitanya as being the Lord, and he was, of course, in his mood as a devotee of the Lord. It's a very wonderful verse. Vairagya vidya nija bhakti yoga shikshartam eka purusha puranam Sri Krishna Chaitanya Sharira Dhari Kripam Buddhiyastamaham Papade. That he's come to preach renunciation, to teach knowledge, devotional service, his own bhakti yoga, his own service to the Lord process. Shikshata meka purusha prana. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Surira Dhari has taken this body. Kripam buddhiyas tamaham. I offer my obeisance to him who's at the ocean of mercy. Kripam buddhi tamaham prapadye. So actually Mukunda Dada wrote these verses on the outside of the hut, because when Lord Chaitanya saw those palm leaves, he broke them up. He said, "Don't." He said, "You're just calling me God. I'm not God." But actually, this part of the pastime, we still have those verses. But what I wanted to say to finish with is that one time Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya came to Lord Chaitanya, and he was actually quoting a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam. Tatenu kampam susamikshmano bhujana evatma kritam vipakam hridvag vakubri vidadam namaste jivetyo mukti pade sadai bhak. This is a verse spoken by Lord Brahma, I think, talking about the mood of the gopis and the mood of the residents of Vrindavan, that they, whatever came, good or bad, didn't matter, but they just kept going on. And he actually says, anyone who has this mood of maintaining this identity, maintaining this activity of a servant of the Lord through their life, whether good or bad comes, then the doors to liberation are wide open to such a person. And actually they can attain the lotus feet of Mukti Pade, who's Krishna, the person where Mukti resides at his feet. But when Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya said this verse, he couldn't even say the word Mukti, because this is the sort of impersonalized idea of, I'll be the master of my senses, I will become God, I will be... This whole idea, this spiritual idea that isn't actually about becoming a servant, it's actually about becoming the master. This is the impersonalized idea that Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was previously following. And when he said that verse, he actually said Bhakti Pade Sadai Bhak. He actually changed the words to Mukti, from Mukti Pade to Bhakti Pade. And Lord Chaitanya said, it's very nice, but doesn't that verse say Mukti Pade? And he said, yes, but I can't even say this word Mukti. The verse shouldn't say that. He started to say how the Bhagavatam, it shouldn't say Mukti. This Mukti, Bhakti is the real thing. And Lord Chaitanya very much appreciated that. And he said, that's okay, but you can't change the Shastra. But I appreciate very much your sentiment of saying that actually becoming the servant is the highest and most wonderful position and our eternal position. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give the class. Hare Bol. If there's any quick question, we've got a few minutes. Nothing? Okay. Kantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.